Hello class. Team building has always been my favorite part of competitive Pokemon. I've built dozens of teams that achieved rank 1 on the ladder, and several that saw great success in tournaments as well. I've also helped thousands of less experienced players with their teams. There are many ways something as complicated as team building can go wrong, but in the thousands of teams that have been sent to me, there's one problem I see more than any other: mixing archetypes. For those that aren't familiar, archetypes are a way of classifying and sorting team structures. A team with 6 bulky Pokemon and no reliable way to make progress is called stall. A team with 4 to 5 bulky Pokemon with a reliable way to make progress is called semi-stall. Teams with a mix of bulky Pokemon and offensive Pokemon are called balance. Teams with an emphasis on offensive Pokemon that have 1 or 2 defensive Pokemon are called offense. And teams with no bulky Pokemon that let Pokemon die as part of the typical game plan are called hyper offense. Archetypes are mostly just a way of defining what a team is composed of. What archetype a team is also tells you how that team tries to win. A stall team tries to win by defensively answering the opponent's offensive threats and winning through status, low damaging moves, hazard chip, or even PP stalling. A hyper offense team tries to win by throwing a series of threatening sweepers at the opponent and wearing down their defensive answers, eventually clearing the way for one of their sweepers to win. The archetypes I've defined are the most commonly defined archetypes, but there are lots of sub-archetypes as well. Sticky Web is a sub-archetype of hyper offense. Sun teams can be classified as a sub-archetype of balance, offense, or hyper offense depending on the Sun team. Hazard Stack can be a sub-archetype of balance, offense, or hyper offense as well. So I don't want to see anyone in the comments section asking, what about the Rain archetype? Some consider Rain an archetype on its own, but most will just say that Rain can fall under the balance, offense, or hyper offense umbrella, depending on how offensive the Rain team is. So now you have a good idea of what archetypes are. So what does it mean to mix archetypes? Well, it simply means that you have Pokemon or sets on your team that strictly belong on different archetypes. This team, for example, is primarily a hyper offense build. Iron Valiant, Hatterene, Ursaluna, and Enamorus all fit well on hyper offense, but then we also have this specially defensive Heatran, which is more of a balance or bulky balance Pokemon. And then we have a rest Sleep Talk Dondozo, which shouldn't be seen outside of stall or semi-stall. If you were to ask me how to classify this team, I'd call it a hyper offense, since 4 of the 6 Pokemon fit on hyper offense, but it really isn't. It's more of a mix of hyper offense and stall. So why is it a problem to be running a Rest Sleep Talk Dondozo on the same team as, say, this Booster Energy Iron Valiant? Plenty of teams run offensive Pokemon and walls. This team I have, which was very successful on the ladder, uses a Swords Dance Life Orb Blaziken right next to an Alomomola. So why is that okay, but not Rest Talk Dondozo with Iron Valiant? What makes a Blaziken and Alomomola a balanced team, but Iron Valiant and Dondozo is a mix of stall and hyper offense? Well, it comes down to 2 main principles: passivity and pacing. Let's go over passivity first. Passivity is defined as the acceptance of what happens without active response or resistance. And that's very similar to what it means in competitive Pokemon, which essentially is, how easy is this Pokemon to switch into? How many Pokemon can easily switch into it? How threatening are the Pokemon that can switch into it? If a lot of threatening Pokemon can easily switch into a Pokemon, it's extremely passive. If a Pokemon has only a few select defensive counters, then it's not passive. Something like a Choice Specs Kyurem is not passive at all. Almost nothing can switch into it safely. As far as meta-relevant Pokemon go, it's just Blissey and Assault Vest Galarian Slowking. Speaking of Blissey, now that is a passive Pokemon. The most offensively threatening thing most Blissey can do is just use Seismic Toss. Most Pokemon don't mind taking a little bit of damage to be in a better spot offensively. Ogerpon Wellspring, Iron Valiant, Rillaboom, Zamazenta, and basically every other physical attacker can easily switch in on Blissey. Not only do far fewer Pokemon safely switch into Kyurem, but the 2 that can are very defensive, and thus the Kyurem user isn't in a scary position. A lot of Pokemon can switch into Blissey, and many of those are some of the most powerful breakers in the tier. The Blissey user definitely is in a scary position, unless their team has solid switch-ins to breakers like Ogerpon Wellspring and Rillaboom. You can probably see now why Stall emerged as an archetype. A ton of stall Pokemon, like Blissey and Dondozo, are very passive. Passive Pokemon allow very threatening breakers to enter the field, which means you need defensive walls to switch into those breakers. Defensive walls are almost always passive, so to support passive Pokemon, you generally want more passive Pokemon, leading to an archetype of Stall. A full team of walls, most of which are very, very passive. Let's relate this concept to our example team from earlier. This Dondozo set is extremely passive. If this Dondozo lets a Nasty Plot Darkrai enter the field for free, what do? Well, you can't do much. This Heatran's not liking a +2 Dark Pulse, and nothing else on the team is either. So you're just in a lot of trouble. Now, if this Dondozo was on a stall team, and this Ursaluna was instead, say, an unaware Clodsire, it would be no problem that you let in Darkrai easily. But it's not just letting in a bunch of threatening breakers and sweepers that the team isn't prepared to deal with. That's not the only problem of Dondozo. Hyper offense teams work best when they can constantly throw powerful attacks at your opponent. They don't want to let up that pressure, because that can give your opponent a chance to recover. So say this Iron Valiant gets a lot of damage on a Corviknight with Thunderbolt, and then it goes down to a Brave Bird. So you get the Thunderbolt damage and the Brave Bird recoil. You can maybe scare it out with your Heatran or your Enamorus, and then later in the game, that Corviknight's going to be so weak that your Ursaluna can kill it with a Facade without needing to set up. That's really great. You're not going to have to take a Body Press. You only have to take Helmet Chip once. Getting that Corviknight chipped down for Ursaluna is amazing. But what if you enter with your Dondozo at some point to answer your opponent's Dragonite, say? That's going to give that Corviknight an opportunity to come in, roost up, and undo all the work that Iron Valiant did. So this Dondozo does a lot more damage to the team being so passive than just letting threatening breakers in. It hurts the rest of the team in many ways. If we look at the other example team with Alomomola and Blaziken, you'll notice we don't have this passive problem. Unlike Dondozo, Alomomola has Flip Turn, so it can pivot out on threats that try to enter on it. It also has Wish, so if a threatening breaker comes in as it uses Wish, it can switch into something like Ting-Lu, Iron Hands, Galarian Weezing to take that attack and heal up. It can also use Tickle to make any physical breakers that enter a lot less threatening. Despite both being defensive water types, Alomomola is way less passive than Dondozo. But passivity isn't the only reason you don't want to mix archetypes. There's also pacing. Pacing is another simple concept. If the Pokemon is offensive, the question to ask is, how long does it need to achieve its goal? If the Pokemon is defensive, the question to ask is, how long can it survive in a matchup where its defensive capabilities are needed? A Pokemon like a Focus Sash Glamora doesn't need a lot of time. It sets Stealth Rock, then it dies. It's just meant to get Stealth Rock on the field, hopefully Toxic Spikes through its ability, and that's it. It's usually done in 2 or 3 turns. A Booster Energy Iron Moth also doesn't need a lot of time. It enters on a promising target, clicks Fiery Dance once or twice, and then it's either quickly going to sweep or be put down by a defensive answer like Ting-Lu. Iron Moth and Glamora both either achieve their goals quickly or fail quickly. Hydrapple is a different story. Say we're using a Life Orb Nasty Plot set. It's extremely slow, so it'll probably set up, take damage while doing so, attack, take damage while doing so again, hopefully get a kill or a lot of damage on something, but then it'll be forced out. Taking hits and Life Orb recoil makes it hard to stay in for a long time, but you can utilize Regenerator to restore your health. Depending on how many hits you took, you may need to heal with Regenerator multiple times before going for another setup attempt or attack. Hydrapple is a great breaker, but it takes a long time to do it. This team you're seeing as background footage has a Regenerator Slowking and a Roost Moltres. It's a team designed to play the long game when needed, to give Hydrapple the time it needs. Something like Ogerpon Wellspring definitely doesn't get the job done as fast as Glamora or Iron Moth, but it breaks a lot faster than Hydrapple typically, so it's somewhere in the middle. Now, of course, this is speaking generally. Sometimes Glamora will look amazing into your opponent's team, or you'll need it later to absorb toxic spikes, so you might intentionally preserve it, and your lead Glamora enters the field several times. Or maybe you're facing a bulky team where Iron Moth looks really good, and the booster speed doesn't matter much, so you switch it in and out a lot. Maybe your opponent's team absolutely sucks against Hydrapple, and it just sweeps in 10 turns. But most of the time, Pokemon have a certain amount of time they need to achieve their goal. Let's talk about some defensive examples of pacing now. Rocky Helmet Landorus is an extremely popular defensive pivot on offense teams. It switches into threats like Kingambit, Cinderace, Ceruledge, Zamazenta, Scizor, and more. But how many times can it switch in? If we look at Kingambit, it can only switch in twice, assuming nothing else chips it down. Landorus is a great wall while it's alive, but it doesn't last long. Gliscor, on the other hand, lasts forever. Gliscor can switch into a Cinderace, Zamazenta, or Scizor a dozen times and still be healthy to do it again. That's why you see Landorus on more offensive teams and Gliscor on more defensive teams. Most defensive teams use slower breaking strategies, like racking up hazard damage, so they want Gliscor to be around for a long time. More offensive teams would rather have the effectively superior defense of Landorus granted through Intimidate, the damage from Rocky Helmet, the power of Landorus's Earthquakes, having way higher attack than Gliscor. This comes at the price of longevity, but offensive teams are designed to win or lose quickly, so Landorus is more worthwhile. If we go back to our example with Dondozo on this hyper-offense team, you'll see that the pacing of this team is way off. One of Dondozo's main benefits is that it can last a really long time. This set could wall a Dragonite or a Zamazenta for every rest it has at least. But that longevity doesn't matter because everything else on this team is designed to die quickly. Ursaluna has a Flame Orb. It's around for a good time, not a long one. Iron Valiant has a booster energy. It's not meant to come in multiple times. Hatterene has a weakness policy. These Pokemon aren't meant to survive. They're meant to come in, do as much damage as possible, and die quite quickly. And then there's this Dondozo. This can last several hundred turns against physical setup sweepers, but it doesn't matter since this team will rarely have games that go beyond 20 turns. Dondozo's strengths just aren't being utilized. Here's another example of a team with pacing issues. 4 Pokemon on this team look like balance. We've got a Scarf Landorus, Boots Palt, standard removal Tusk with Bulk Up, and a Wish Alomomola. So 4 Pokemon, these look like they're on a balanced team, but then we have an Aurora Veil, Alolan Ninetales, and a Booster Energy Iron Crown. Especially with stored power, this set basically has one shot to sweep. It enters once, it sets up, and it either wins or does nothing. When you have an entire team of Pokemon with relatively slow pacing and one Pokemon with extremely fast pacing, you'll often feel like you're playing a team with 5 Pokemon. This Iron Crown will either do everything or nothing, and most games, it'll do nothing. And so you'll just be using a balanced team with 5 Pokemon. If we look back at my Blaziken team, you'll notice everything has a similar level of longevity, with at least the appearance of the exception of Blaziken. Thanks to Grassy Terrain Healing though, and Wish Passing from Alomomola, Blaziken can stick around as long as the rest of the team. So, now you understand passivity and pacing. These are the 2 main concepts that dictate what archetypes are. If you're getting something out of this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps out a lot. Now, there are a couple things I want to clarify about pacing and passivity. The first is that while passivity is itself a purely negative concept, that doesn't mean you should avoid passive Pokemon. A lot of passive Pokemon are really, really good, like Blissey and Dondozo. Despite being passive, these Pokemon have insane longevity and amazing defensive stats. The second thing I want to clarify is that the pacing of your team will almost never be exact across the board. If you use an Ogerpon Wellspring on a semi-stall team, don't get worried because the team can last a very long time, but Wellspring can break fairly quickly. It's not an issue. It's much more of a problem if your team doesn't give your breaker enough time to break. Having too much time isn't a problem. If your team gives your breaking core way too much time to break, that probably means you have issues in other areas, but the breaking core having too much time isn't an issue in and of itself. Third, I want to say that not every Pokemon has a set level of passivity or pacing. In fact, most don't. It changes based on the set. The Dondozo set we looked at with Rest, Talk, Curse, Crunch is about as passive as it gets. But Curse, Protect, Earthquake, Avalanche Dondozo is not passive at all. It's actually a very threatening sweeper that I've used with success on Hyper Offense teams. And since it doesn't have Rest, its pacing is more in line with Hyper Offense. It usually doesn't last very long. A Booster Energy Calm Mind Iron Valiant generally only belongs on offense and hyper offense teams, but a Choice Specs Iron Valiant fits well on balance. Unfortunately, there's no hard rule to determine how passive a Pokemon or set is and what its pacing is. The best way is just to test that set on ladder and observe. Does this Pokemon let a ton of breakers in? If so, it's probably passive. If it's a breaker, ask yourself, does it break quickly? If it's a sweeper, ask yourself, does it sweep or die quickly? Or does it need to come in many times to slowly wear answers down? If it's a defensive Pokemon, is it usually dying first as your opponent dismantles your defensive core? Or does it only fall once its supporting teammates have let it down? Ask yourself these questions and you can determine how passive a Pokemon is and what its pacing is. Now I'd like to go over some examples where the concepts of passivity and pacing can be applied just to make sure you're understanding. Cinderace is one of the best options for hazard control out there, but it only switches the sides of hazards with court change. It can't remove them. So teams that use Cinderace as their sole source of hazard control are almost always offense or hyper offense teams. These teams have much quicker games, so it's far less likely that the opponent will have a chance to reset hazards after a court change, and if they do, there likely won't be a long, drawn-out game of switching around, so the hazards won't hurt too much anyway. Cinderace is used on bulkier teams as well, but almost always with other removal, like Corviknight or Great Tusk. Despite being an amazing special wall, Blissey is almost never seen outside of stall. Because it's so passive, balanced teams and more offensive builds tend to prefer special walls like Ting Lu, Galarian Slowking, and Assault Vest Iron Crown, which are much less passive. We already did this example, but again, Gliscor and Landorus are another great example for illustrating the split in passivity and pacing. Gliscor is more passive but lasts a lot longer, Landorus is less passive but doesn't last as long. Therefore, Landorus is seen more on offensive teams, and Gliscor is seen more on defensive teams. Booster Energy Raging Bolt typically doesn't want to switch out and lose the Photosynthesis boost, so it fits best on offense and hyper offense teams. Choice Specs Raging Bolt, on the other hand, is meant to come in many times, so you'll almost never see it on hyper offense. It's used on balance and offense teams. Garganacl is a defensive Pokemon, but thanks to Salt Cure being so incredibly difficult to switch into, it's not passive at all. Ting Lu is seen on all archetypes, from Stall to Hyper Offense, but with slightly different sets. Temporary or non-healing items like Red Card and Rocky Helmet are more popular on offense and Hyper Offense. On bulkier teams, almost all Ting Lu will use Rest to increase their longevity, although it does make them more passive. Hopefully this gives you an idea of how the concepts of pacing and passivity can guide you to make the right decisions when team building. Now, this is definitely not all there is to team building. As I said, it's extremely complicated and there's a lot to know. I'd recommend checking out my Team Building Guides playlist for more info. Still, if you understand the concepts of pacing and passivity, you'll at least avoid the #1 most common mistake I see new players make. If you learned something and or enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. I upload a lot of educational competitive Pokemon content like this. Also, let me know in the comments what your favorite passive Pokemon is. Mine is Chansey. I don't know why, but I just love the design and I think it has a great shiny form. Well, that's all. Class dismissed.